We are going to be talking about tonight. We have been talking about all the generations. We're going to do some review in a second. But my goal, it's a big goal, we're going to try, is to get through Generation X and the generation Millennial, which is actually my generation. I'm a young millennial, but here we go. So I don't like talking about myself, and so this is going to be a lot of fun. And let's review really quickly. Obviously, one of the reasons for this class is that, if you don't know this, it's very evident in our culture. There's no love between the generations. That's just obvious, right? The Zoomers, so I'm going to be calling Gen Z Zoomers, by the way. I always thought we should have called this the Boomers to Zoomers. But Generation Z, man, they hate the older generations. Millennials, we have been warring with the Boomers for the longest time. And so generation conflict has just been a reality all the way back to the Old Testament too. I've been reading through Numbers and Deuteronomy, and Moses is reminding, hey, the generation before you, they messed up. And that's why we've been in the desert for 40 years. So this generational conflict has always been going on. And that's why we're talking about this class. We're really trying to just start the conversation for you to think multi-generational. How can we love other generations and other people that are not like us, even though we're in the same church, even though we're in the same state, in the same city, in the same country? There's a lot that gets in the way of us just because of small little things that I think studying, I was just telling someone in the crowd, I think studying the generations and your characteristics in your generation and previous generations and future is way more helpful and practical than actually doing like personality tests or Enneagrams or anything like that. I think this is way more fun. It's way more broad in general, so don't get offended tonight if I say something about Gen Xers or Millennials. Just because the general stuff we're talking about doesn't mean that it applies to you, even though you might be in that generation. But you're probably going to say, yeah, a lot of my friends had that experience. And so we're trying to understand the times we live in, discipling every generation for all of Christ, for all of life, and unity in the church, and that's a big deal. And so we're talking tonight, my goal is to get through Generation X, which I'm about to talk about, in the Millennials. And then for the next 2 weeks after that, my goal is to talk a ton about Gen Z. I got into student ministry almost 10 years ago, and I started studying. I was like, man, I'm dealing with this generation. I'm older than them. I don't know what to do for them. Like I need to start studying something on them. So I started reading on Gen Z, and that's what got me into this topic. And when Trevor and I were talking about what to do, it was exciting to do this. So Trevor's talked about this before, of the reason why the generations matter. Some of them blew it. My generation certainly blew it, and we'll talk about that. But God wants us to take notice of how we can move forward in loving Christ in every area. What I'm going to do is really similar to Pastor Trevor and how he has taught. You see on your piece of paper, you've got 3 main points and then just subpoints to talk about what does this look like practically. And then I'm going to take 1 or 2 questions. Maybe I shouldn't do that for the sake of time, but if you have questions in our getting practical time before we move to the next point, just throw your hand up and we'll try to take some questions. Sound good? But make sure they're good questions so that way we don't go over time. Gen X, let's talk about who is Gen X. If you were born between these dates in the room, 1965 to 1979, if you would just identify yourself. Okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got 5 in the room. Okay, so again, Josh Costa, were you born between 1965 and 1979? Yes. Okay, so we have 6 Gen Xers in the room. And so like I said, do not be offended if I say something about your generation that perturbs you. It really is. It actually, all of the research that I've been doing on this has been from this book, The Generations by Jean Twenge. And this book is amazing. I've been tearing it up. She is much more liberal than I am, and she has some things that I don't agree with for sure. I'll put it up here. It's Generations, the real difference between Z, Millennials, Xers, Boomers, and Silents, and what they mean for America's future. I'll have it up here if you want to look at it. She is definitely not a Christian. She is much more liberal than any of us in the room, and I am very conservative. So I was very annoyed at some things she said, but whatever. It was helpful to at least see what she was saying, and I think she was spot on a few things. Okay. Hopefully the TVs will come back on. Do I need to turn them on, you think? Okay. All right. Let's talk about their parents. Gen X is Silents and Boomers. Your children, Gen Xers, are, if you're an older, my dad is technically a Boomer. He's right at the end, and a really old Xer. So I think he was 62, but he identifies with Xers. He loves the 80s. That's a big deal for the Gen Xers. They love the 80s. No better time to be alive than the 80s. And so I'm technically one of the children of Gen Xers. Gen Z right now in the student ministry is their generation. Zoomers is what I call them. Polars is the next generation. Polars is we won't talk about it too much until the last one. I'll probably have one point about them. The term polars just means you either, from my understanding, you either are growing up in a polar opposite home from your peers. You're either extremely conservative because your parents are Trump lovers, conservatives, red-blooded Republicans, or you're blue-blooded Democrat, liberal, Kamala lovers, and everything that comes with that. And you're raised in that. So that's the polar generation. And I don't even know what the post-polar generation is going to look like. But your current age is 46, 60. The big thing that I thought was helpful in this book is that 1979 is the cutoff. So that really means you were 21. Even if it's 81, 82, you could still be a Zennial or more. You could identify more as Gen X. That's really you're 21 years old by 9/11 is the cutoff that she gives. And I think that's really helpful. That's a big date. There's events that are important, and technology is important when you think about the generations. So, I want to talk about three crucial parts to Generation X. Before we do that, I want to just talk about what shaped Generation X. And we're going to go deeper into this, a few of these. But the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall are huge for Gen X. Some Gen Xers you might know, by the way, Elon Musk, Tom Brady, Jennifer Aniston, Leonardo DiCaprio. There's a lot that are out there. The AIDS crisis, and the sexual ethics that were coming out and taboos and talk of sexual ethics was really changing during this time for them. They grew up in the aftermath. This is really important. They grew up in the aftermath of Watergate and Vietnam. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts on both of those events, but I'm not going to talk about those now. They grew up in a time where nobody trusted the media. The media's erosion of trust that we all know today really started for Gen X. And it really was interesting to me as I started reading about them. They really became the most politically apathetic generation in American history. They actually still, I think this past election, 2024, was the first time they voted in mass. Gen X, pretty much put Trump in office, if you look at the numbers. And but this is one of the first elections that they've been really powerful in. When they were teenagers and early young adults, they didn't really care about politics. So the get out the vote thing really started with Gen X because they weren't getting out the vote. And that's I believe, because of Watergate, Vietnam. This is cynicism, lack of trust. We don't trust our institutions. We'll talk about they're children of divorce. So the term latchkey kid really starts hitting home for pretty much everybody, is that everybody pretty much becomes a latchkey kid. Your parents are working till 6 p.m. You get out of school at 3 p.m. There's no such thing as after-school programs because those come during the millennial generation. And so what do you do as a Gen Xer? You go home and you watch TV, I guess, and then you ride your bike until the lights come on. That's pretty much what y'all did every single day. And you survived. So there you go. Video games were really coming. Analog was you had an analog childhood, but a digital young adulthood, and so you really had best. They described Gen X as like the first and last. So they were the first with digital, but the last with analog. They were the first. They were the first with video games. They were the first with the big. Really decline in marriage and divorce started rising heavily. They were the first with a lot of single parents, was the taboos were taken off of that in mass. Some cultural moments, Star Wars, obviously a big one. The Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch was interesting to me because I don't think that aired in the 80s, but it was reruns in the 80s. But the Brady Bunch was big because it was a blended family. And think about it, if you're children of divorce, and there's a lot of people that were getting divorced in the 70s and 80s for the Xers, their parents were getting divorced, then the Brady Bunch is a great show because it's telling you about your life, right? There's this air of understanding that this show had for who you were with the Brady Bunch coming together. I've only watched one episode. I'm a millennial, so don't hold it against me. MTV was a big deal. Alternative rock, which used to be a very niche thing, became a huge thing with Nirvana and all of these different bands that had a really different tone to them. It became alternative rock just became rock for Xers by the end. Technology was coming on the scene. Apple, IBM, microwaves and VCRs were a big deal. And so the summary of Gen X is a few things. They're known for being really, really, really independent, really, really tough, more cynical towards institutions. They continue this advent of individualism, and they inject, if they don't inject anything else, they inject individualism into their kids, which was going to come up a lot for the millennials because that's a big deal for us, and that's a big problem for us. They're really described, she describes them, Dr. Jean describes them as this middle child generation. The boomers were a big deal. Xers are in the middle, and they actually had a lot of children. Having 3 children was the cool thing for Xers to do, apparently. And so the millennials was another big generation. So Xers are right in the middle, and they're forgotten most often. And the millennials and boomers are just fighting back and forth. I don't know why, I'm just telling you what happened. And so I want to talk about 3 crucial things to think about for Gen X in their discipleship. So when you think about, if you're meeting with a Gen X person, these are just some discipleship themes that are going to come up in their life that you're not going to find in this book, but as I'm reading and just studying God's Word and thinking about Gen X, these are just some things I see these as big markers, and you could put a lot more. So this is not the gospel. These are just, honestly, these are just what I think is going on in Gen X. And the first one is this independence of the latchkey kid, and that first subpoint is everyone for themselves. Okay, so this idea of everyone for themselves is really not biblical, okay? But it's a big deal for Gen X. Now, listen, we're going to talk about this in a second. But the independence of Gen X and the toughness of Gen X is actually extremely admirable. It's actually probably my favorite thing about Gen X is how tough and independent y'all were as a generation. So I put some scriptures on the screen. You can see Acts 2, 42 to 47. You see the early church, one of the big themes that you see in the early church is they give themselves over to each other. They sell things and give to all in need, and they love one another. And that's really antithetical to the Xers, because if you're independent and tough, I don't need anybody else. I was able to ride my bike and get skin knees and do whatever I wanted until the street lights came on. And so why are you whining? You get your act together. So there's this independence, and it really led to, I'm coining the term tougher than Jesus mentality. And again, I'm not saying that Gen X is sinful for being tough. I actually think it's a wonderful, good thing that my generation desperately needs to learn. But this tougher than Jesus mentality is not the only thing Jesus teaches his disciples is to be tough. He wants them to also be gentle, to love, to be joyful, to be at peace with all men, to love one another, to love your enemy as yourself. And I think one of the hard things for the Gen X generation that's coming up, they're starting to think about it. When I started youth ministry, I've been in youth ministry going on 8-9 years now, almost 10 years. So the students that I had back in the day, they were all Gen X, older Gen X people, and they were starting to see their parents decline. And that's a big thing that Gen Xers are going to have to start dealing with is aging parents. How do I take care of them? And my parents, for instance, they run a really funny job. My dad and stepmom, they run a independent living home. And so they're dealing with, 80, 90, even 100-year-old people. And the saddest thing is when I go there, I see these people, and they're just not cared for. You got people that are shoved into these homes, and it's nice. They're nice apartments, but they're shoved in there, and their kids live in New York, and they never visit them. And my dad was just telling me that they had this one lady that has dementia, really hard onset dementia, and she's trying to break into this other lady's home, and her kids are in New York, and they don't really even care. It's really sad, really sad. And I think for Gen X, that's going to be a big, difficult trial for them, is to take care of their aging parents and to move through that. And this idea of tougher than Jesus, again, I actually think there's pros and cons to the toughness and independence. So don't get me wrong. But what I mean by that is I think there can be a weakness there, even in the toughness. And I think the weakness comes when you think about the fact, as we're going to see, that they didn't have, they're children of divorce. We'll talk about that in a second. So they either didn't have a mom or a dad in the home, or they were going back and forth. And so what I think that really part of the problem for Gen X is they're going to have to learn, and if you're a Gen Xer, as we're talking about this, you might even be realizing this yourself, is that I'm a father, and so I'm wrestling with my kids, and I'm tough. But then I also have to be gentle. And so as a father, we need to be tough and then gentle. That's what God has called us to do. Be strong, stand in the gap, and at the same time, tickle and love our kids and be gentle with them and care for them and love them. And then at the same time, you might be missing your mom in the picture, and so you miss this strong feminine beauty and gentleness that comes with being a woman. And so in the independence, you kind of lose, in the toughness, you lose the ability to see a nuanced perspective of, hey, toughness isn't everything. There's more that has to be added to the picture. And so I think Jesus, I know Jesus is calling us to more than just toughness. And so as Gen Xers, especially believing Christian Gen Xers, we got to be really faithful to love all of Christ for all of life. And that includes things, not just toughness. Let's keep moving on, though. Lack of trust in leadership. This one blew my mind. I'm just going to be honest. Because it's the opposite of what the millennials did. Okay, so Watergate happens, Vietnam happens, and this lack of trust in leadership in the government, in institutions, starts rotting everything in our society. And for Gen Xers, it's so interesting. My mind was blown reading about this. But for Gen Xers, if you look at the statistics, if you look at political leadership and business leadership, which doesn't mean everything, but if you just look at those two big things, the boomers have boxed y'all out, and you're going to get passed over. The millennials are coming, and we're going to go for those political roles and those CEO roles. Xers, for some reason, and I think I have a solution to it, they've been reluctant to jump into leadership roles. And I think, in my opinion, it's because they've seen the corruptness of it with Vietnam, Watergate. They're just put off by it. We don't really care about that. I just want to live my life. I grew up watching cartoons on Saturday morning, and life was simple, and I just want my life to be simple with what I enjoy. And leadership is hard. And that independence is like, well, I just want to raise my family. I don't want to worry about the stresses of being in leadership. And at the same time that my experience with Gen X parents at times is also this like backseat driver mentality of like, I will never drive the car, but I will complain constantly about who is driving the car. And that is so antithetical. I mean, it's so different than the millennials, because the millennials are like, you'll see in a second, we think everything about ourselves, and we think if I were in charge, it'd be so much better. And so we're going to get into roles of power because everything's messed up and we can fix it because we think we're the best. And for Gen X, they don't do that. And I think it would be really helpful for Gen Xers to think through, as you're discipling Gen Xers, as you're a Gen Xer, some of you in the room, thinking about this, maybe you have children that are Gen X, maybe you have parents that are Gen Xers, encouraging them not to be consumers of ministry, but doers of ministry. Ephesians 4:11-12 shows this to us, but also to encourage to trust leadership in the church, specifically the church, okay? The government and all that, all of it's corrupt and it's all debased, and you shouldn't trust any of it. If you're trusting it, you should stop. But I'm telling you, when it comes to your local things or places like this one right here, you don't have to be dumb and naive. I'm not calling you to do that. What I'm saying is that as Christians, we should trust leadership until they prove us wrong, if that makes sense. We should come with an air before our brothers who are leading us, your pastors, me being one of them even, and assume the best. I might say something tonight that, oh, that's weird. That's weird. Why do they have somebody at Nocatee believe in that? Assume the best. I'm telling you, I don't think I believe anything too weird. But assume the best. Come to your pastors. Trust them. Ask questions in a helpful, kind, gentle way, and save the toughness for the time when it's time to fight. And there's always times to fight. And I love fighting. And so let's fight when it's time to fight, and let's love one another and trust one another when it's time to do that. And so as we think through this, man, we got to go quicker. As we think through this independence, it's a huge thing for Gen X, so it's going to really make everything much quicker. Let's just think about some practical things, and we've talked about these a lot, is we have to think as Gen Xers sacrificially. We have to think with generosity in our hearts, with our wealth. You've earned it. You've worked hard. Okay, but those things have been given to you by Christ. And so we should be generous with our wealth. We should think generously and depend on the church, not ignoring the church. That's a big one too, is giving rise to this idea of, well, I don't really need the church. I can have Jesus in my Bible time all alone. We should disciple people to say, well, that's not the Christian way. That's not what Christ called us to do. He called us to give ourselves to one another. And when you see the early church on the scene in Acts 2, they're doing that. They're giving themselves for one another. And they're selling their possessions and giving to all those in need. Liberals think they're socialists. And what we know as Christians is that they're just being faithful to one another. They're not thinking of themselves higher than one another. They know that everything's been given to them by God, and they're not independent of God. They're Gen Xers, we need to be dependent on God. And that's the first thing. Let's talk about the children of normalized divorce. So this is another. If you got any questions, by the way, throw your hands up, and we'll take questions. But I'm going to keep moving because that was my longest point, and we got a lot more to cover. All right, let's keep going. Children of normalized divorce. Divorce has always been a problem. Jesus talks about divorce in the New Testament. Moses talks about divorce in Deuteronomy 24. So we all know that it's been happening. But the taboo comes off for Gen X. And really, I think the problem with that specifically, actually, I think I have a graph. Let's see. Yep. Okay, so you can see this graph. You see around 1980, it went from, so the numbers were for boomers, they had 88% of boomers had a two-parent home. For Gen Xers, that number dropped down to 77. And on top of that, you had single parenthood on the rise. And so that doesn't look bad until it doesn't look too bad because you can see farther down the graph, and then you're like, oh shoot, 27% of our population is single parents, and 68% are. So it's dropped even another 11%. So if you keep looking, it looks bad, and it is bad. But when you think about that decline so drastically in just 10 years, like that's a big deal. And I think one of the things that in our culture, that's a really big deal. It's a really, really big deal, but we don't talk about it like I'm about to talk about it, is we downplay what divorce actually is. Divorce is one of the most horrific, destructive, evil things that can happen to you as a child or as an adult. I mean, it is. If you've been through divorce, you would agree with me. The idea would be like if for the child, you're living on this planet, and that planet is mom and dad, and the planet is ripped in half, and you're sucked in. And for Gen X, I think a lot of it was downplayed as, oh yeah, my parents got divorced, or their parents got divorced. And it doesn't even have to be your parents. It could be other people's parents. Divorce is, they experienced that, tough on them, but my parents didn't experience that. And again, this comes to this idea of the taboo is removed, and we downplay how bad divorce really is, and we just start accepting it all around the culture. And it's really terrible. It's horrible for the children who will grow up not understanding, and we'll talk about this later, not understanding what a strong, faithful family is supposed to look like. My father, my mom and dad, my mom died when I was 8 years old. And so I didn't experience divorce, but my dad remarried a woman who had been divorced, and so I became not the oldest of 3, but the oldest of 5 kids in a blended family, Brady Bunch style thing. And divorce was extremely hard on my stepbrothers and sister. And it was extremely hard on me just watching them go through that. And not only that, my mom dying at such a young age, there was so much that I still had to learn of what a godly family looks like. And so divorce and the loss of a mom and dad together is difficult. You saw in the picture earlier, even for my son, who I love with all my heart, who's adopted. There are just things that are going to be difficult for him because I'm not his biological father. We just got to be real about that. The world is messy, and I want to love him and care for him, and I'm going to do everything. I'm his daddy, so I take him to the hospital. Nobody else has done that besides my wife and me, and I love that boy, and I want to love him through the realities that I know is just going to be hard for him. And the same thing is true for Gen Xers, is that really we downplayed it, and we didn't think too hard about it, and so what it led to was what I'm calling marriage, sex, and a poor family life. So if you look at the graph, I didn't put a graph up there because I didn't want my covenant eyes to be flagged too much for this. I was going to look sex rates for Gen X, and I just thought that would be not a good idea. So I didn't do that. But Gen X, and I'm not going to be graphic at all, but Gen X had some of the highest premarital sex rates of any generation, and that's for obvious reasons. You're a latchkey kid. You get into your high school, middle school years, you got nothing to do in the afternoon. You got this girlfriend, and so you're having premarital sex. You couple that with divorce, and what you've got is a generation that knows nothing about sex, marriage, and fruitfulness and biblical marriage and what it's supposed to really look like. And I put Ephesians 5:22 to 33. You see the scriptures, what Paul is even doing for this Ephesian church is showing what is a man and a woman and a father and a mother and children and people who work in the home, what are they supposed to look like? What are they supposed to do? And for Gen X, you started losing that. And that's where, again, Gen X is the first and the last in many ways. They were the first to experience this, and they were the last to also experience the world before this destruction of the home. So it's a really interesting dichotomy because for millennials, there was so much more going on than just divorce. I mean, we were far past that. We were talking. We'll try to get to that in a second. And then the last thing is strong families are really hard to come by. Deuteronomy 6:1-9 talks about training your children up in the Lord, that you need to train them from the youngest of ages. When you walk by the way, you're teaching them the scriptures. How can you do that if your dad's not in the home? Fathers, how are you supposed to do that if you're not in the home with your sons all the time? And that's what it leads to is that, again, the Lord redeems and he saves and he can do so much in somebody's life out of this mess. So don't get me wrong. What we're talking about is generalities, okay? The Lord can save and do miraculous things out of this. But this is the reality of what our world's dealing with. So we're talking about non-believer Gen X people probably experience everything I just talked about and more. And what that leads to is destruction and not understanding what does a real family look like? What does it really look like to discipline your kids so they don't turn out to be monsters 10 years from now? How do we care for our children rightly so they're not menaces to the society? That's a hard question. And if you don't have a father and mother in the home, it's hard to answer that because you've never seen it before. You've never seen it before. And so, again, the Lord can overcome so many things, and he has. He overcomes all things in the believer's life. And he can overcome these things in Gen X and the family destruction. And just getting practical for a moment is that as Gen Xers, we just need to recognize that environment and just recognize it was not a good thing. And it's not normal. It's not normal to be in a family that's destroyed by divorce in this way. And that means that family worship, family practices, biblical family practices, looking back on church history, how did the Puritans disciple their children and create the greatest country that's ever existed in the world, America? You ever thought about that question before? You should think about that more often. How did the Puritans do it? You should go find out how they did it. They had family worship, and they catechized their children, and they disciplined them in the Lord, and they raised them up to know the scriptures. And that is lost when you have a whole generation that's just imploding with divorce and single parenthood and premarital sex. And so as a generation, as a church, we need, as we think about discipling Gen Xers, we need to really think family. And this is going to be a big part of my talks is family. How do we think about family, children, man, woman, husband, wife, father, mother? How do we think about that? Because I think all of us in the room have gotten by as citizens, but we're more than that. We're created in the image of God as men and women. And so how do we actually become the men and women that God has called us to be? Okay, this one is going to hurt for you Xers. I'm so sorry. But you're digital dinos. Okay, I called it dinos because I called you dinos because I thought it was softer than dinosaurs. And so, but you really are digital dinos. Okay, and so what I mean by that is, and it's really hard. It was so interesting reading this book. Let me just read to you. I wrote it down because I was like, man, seeing Gen Xers parent their kids through technology, this has been one of the most striking things that I just haven't understood because your generation was the first with digital stuff. But we've moved past email. Okay, that's kind of the problem is we've moved past email into something that's really foreign these days. She says this, She's quoting a Gen Xer. She says, "My generation will be the last to have known the world in its analog form, and as a result, we've grown old before actually getting old. We've become dinosaurs before even hitting 50. She says this too. Other Gen X parents would love for their children to put down their smartphones and get out of the house, but have given up trying to fight Gen Z's technology obsession." And then she says right after that, "Still, many Gen Xers want to make sure their kids don't do the same dumb stuff they did, looking back on their own childhoods with a combination of nostalgia and postponed terror, how they wondered that they ever managed to make it out alive." And what I think, just to interpret all of what she just said, Generation X, when they were children, was really interesting, and this is really cool, and I think it's cool, is that y'all got to experience cultural moments all at the same time. So you went to the movies, and you saw the same movies. There wasn't a billion movies out there, and you couldn't just go on the internet and find all these like subcultures and all this. You went to the movies, and there was probably 3 or 4 movies on at most, and you just watched them with your friends, even if they were bad, and you talked about them. And then you watched the cartoons on Saturday morning, and you're all watching the same cartoons on Saturday morning. And so you're experiencing culture all together. Well, then you become, and so my first point is this, is that this is a weird statement, but I think for a lot of Gen Xers, they use technology, and they've thought about technology as an escape from the harsh reality of the real world. And that's a big deal. That's a really big deal, because I think it's prolonged a lot of hard conversations. I think in our culture, if you think about it, you'll agree with me, is that in our culture, we've got a lot of, listen, I play fantasy football, I do March Madness bracket, but I care way more about being a dad than that. Okay, but there's a lot of people that care way more about their fantasy football bracket, and maybe even their jobs, or the March Madness bracket, or a TV show, or Netflix, or social media, than they care about what's most important. And I think that's because Gen X, in a lot of ways, used technology for escape from the real world. And I think that's led to this laissez-faire mindset I'm about to talk about with Gen Z. They're now kids who are right above us on the 4th floor, okay? Gen X works extremely hard because they're really tough and they're really independent, and at the same time they get to play really hard. Is how I've understood Gen X to be. They work really hard, and even as kids, they had jobs early, they worked hard, and then they played super hard on their bikes and ran around the neighborhoods and watched cartoons on Saturday, and they had a great time. And there's this polar of both. And I think what that's led to is that I'm kind of priming you for what I'm about to say, which is that I think Gen X thinks about technology like a digital neighborhood. And so what I want you to hear, Gen X parents, in a very loving and caring way, and your generation to hear, is that the digital neighborhoods are not like your old neighborhoods. Your old neighborhoods, you could ride your bike and be out till the streetlights came on, and that's cool. I wish I did have, in some ways, a childhood a little bit like that, but not to that extreme. And that's awesome. I think that's so cool. But the digital world, I put Ecclesiastes 1:1-4 up there because there's nothing new under the sun, so don't get me wrong. But the digital world is the most dangerous, awful thing that we have normalized just giving to children. I want you to think about how Gen X thinks about technology. And again, this is where I'm going deep because I'm about to go even deeper with the millennials and go hard on myself. But I think Gen X thinks about technology like a phone on the wall that they used to have when they grew up. The phone on the wall that had the cord, you roll up and you click it and you could go about this far away and you couldn't go much farther. That phone on the wall was benign until somebody called you or you called somebody, right? So it could be used for malicious purposes, but it was benign and sat on the wall. The other way is, again, this riding your bike in the old neighborhood style. And technology is not that. Technology today is not that at all. It is very, very dangerous. It is the worst neighborhoods you could possibly go in at night and walking around with a trumpet saying, "Come mess me up." I don't know how else to say it. Think about all of the things that you could access, from violence to suicide ideation, to pornography, to woke thinking. I mean, you just use your creative imagination for a moment and think about what I'm trying to say, which is that those digital neighborhoods, you wouldn't want your kids anywhere near that. But as our society has gone, we've put those into their pockets. And for a lot of Gen X parents, even some that I've seen in churches, we've just let them go. And what happens is you let them go and you realize, what has happened to my child? They're not the same anymore. And as we'll talk about in the next couple weeks, is that Gen Z is dealing with, they're riding around these digital neighborhoods and there's millions of predators right after them, right after they come outside the door. And specifically what I mean by that is the algorithm. So if you don't understand how the algorithm works, I'm just going to say it very simply. The algorithm is a tool to get you more connected on your phone by giving you what you want to see, is basically what the algorithm is. And it makes social media more fun. And so what your teenagers are experiencing or your grandchildren are experiencing is they're on their phones and they're seeing videos. So if you're a young boy, just think about this for a moment. If you're a young boy hitting puberty, what are some of the things you would want to see? So think about that for a moment. The algorithm knows your age. It knows your gender. It knows where you live. It knows who you interact with. My phone right now is probably listening to me. We all know this, right? We've experienced this. And these things chase you down. And they pull you deeper. I can't tell you, we'll talk about this in Gen Z in a few weeks, but I can't tell you the amount of teenage girls that come into our ministry who start off really wonderful and sweet, most unassuming, innocent middle school girls come into our ministry. And they get a phone 6th, 7th grade year because they start getting bullied because all their friends have phones at school. And then they're just sucked deeper and deeper, and they're allowed to watch it at night, and so now their sleep is messed up because of these phones, and the science is proving that. And they're watching the most horrific, awful things, and they end up taking their lives. And we'll talk about that. Gen Z is literally a generation that is killing themselves, and we all know why, and it's because of these things. And so that's why for Gen X parents, I think one of the things Gen X parents really need to do is not check out with technology. It's the most difficult thing to do. I'm starting to feel like a dinosaur. I've gotten rid of all social media because I don't want to live in this world anymore with social media. And so I'm moving away from it. And I think for Gen X parents, the thought comes like this. I've heard it before, and I'm just correcting it now because I'm recognizing where it's come with studying Gen X. Is this idea, since I figured out how to traverse my neighborhoods and grow up in this world, my students should be able to do that too. Or they need to grow up sometime, so they might as grow up right now. And I'm just telling you, this is just not good. This is not good thinking. As parents, we don't want to coddle our children and put them in boxes and never let them see the light of day, though we might want to sometimes. We don't do that. We know that's not right. So we know that. We want them, but we also should want them to be exposed to the world, but not all at once. We want them to be, as 1 Corinthians talks about, we want them to be foolish in the things of the world and wise to the things of Scripture and godliness. We don't want them to experience all of sexuality on their phones when they should be experiencing that in their marriages as they bring children into this world. And it's led to really horrible things. And so I want to emphasize how dangerous this is in this, because I think it's going to be a strain more and more for Gen X parents as they get older, as they realize I should have done more to protect my kids from the perils of online. Gen X, as the author says, has really been put in a museum when it comes to technology. And I think they need to wake up, fight hard, be tough, and say, we're not doing that anymore. We're gonna take our kids back in that way. Okay, we're done with Gen X. Any questions? I know I've just shot a lot of bullets at you. Please don't be offended. I'm just describing what she said, so.
Maybe a practical way to help kids, because we have young middle schoolers.
Yes.
That are on the phone.
Yes.
I can see that it's obviously
yes.
dangerous.
Yeah.
But how do you
100%.
Those things you just say, hey, as a family, we'll take it all off, or I mean, how do you?
So I think I'll be the one to tell you, I think that's not a bad idea, and I think more people should think that way. I think one of our pastors at Nocatee said, one day we're going to think about smartphones like cigarettes. We are going to stop. We're going to be like, what were we thinking? And I think my generation, I'm about to talk about millennials in a second, my generation, you see it when you go out to Texas Roadhouse, my generation has moved up to the iPads. So you got this kid with an iPad, headphones on, watching their show, and then mom and dad are sitting right here on their phones, and nobody's communicating. And I think in very short time, we're going to wake up to the reality of what were we doing. And so here's what I would say. If you've already done it, here's one of the best practical advices Richard Lucas and Tina Lucas it unlocks so many things for me as dealing with teenagers and teenage parents, is you are in full control of them. You own them. And what I mean by that is not like I own my children because I can give them spankings anytime I need to. They're teenagers now, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But you own them financially. Okay, so if they want to go out and mess their lives up on their phone, they can do that, but you don't have to pay for that. Does that make sense? You have full control over that. You don't want them to do that, but you have full control financially over that. They don't need to have that job. You own them financially. So all the decisions and all the power is in your hands. What I would say, so that's my first answer is, I don't think it's crazy. We all should just stop and say it's not crazy. It's okay for people to do that. My son, he's 6, and he wants a phone. I'm like, no, you're not getting a phone. It's the craziest thing ever. You're not doing that. I don't care if anybody bullies you. You're not doing that because I've seen it for 10 years of how bad it is. Here, let's move over. Okay, so let's say you're like, okay, we're going to have our kids have phones. And frankly, we're growing up in a time when we just want our kids to have phones because we want to know where they're at, right? We want to know maybe they're walking home from school, taking the bus, et cetera, et cetera. I've seen some parents, they get not phones, but they get Apple Watches. And you can control that a lot easier. You can't search the web or do crazy things on that. I think that's a great idea. It's a little bit more technical, so you'd have to get that worked out. But I've seen some parents do that really well. I think so here's what I'm saying is how hard it is for Gen X parents to control the phones. So I learned this recently, so I'm becoming a dinosaur. But I was talking to a student, and I was like, why don't you guys text on like your iMessages anymore? Have you noticed that teens don't text on iMessage anymore? So like your traditional text message that you text on your Apple phone, they don't really use anymore. They use WhatsApp, Signal, Discord, these other apps. And I was like, why is that? I've been noticing you guys don't text me unless it's like on that app. And it's because it's encrypted. And so if their parents did have some sort of parental technology on it, there's no way they could see it. So you physically have to take the phone, unlock it, and go through message after message after message. And I'm just telling you, if your teenager is anything like the ones I deal with in my ministry, they send thousands of text messages daily. And so that's an exhausting job to do. I would say the only way to get past that would be you've just got to do it daily. I think every day you got to take their phone away for an hour and say, I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to read through your text messages quickly, and maybe you go back and forth as husband and wife. And hey, explain to me, why is there a deleted message here? What did you say? Why did you delete it? What did you mean by that? Why did you react that way? Why would you say that? I wouldn't say just discipline, but I would say it's an opportunity to say, hey, when you said that to them and they reacted that way and you guys got into this little tiff, do you understand that like you can't just talk about these really deep things over text messages? That's actually like face-to-face contact that you need to have. They have no concept of that. They have no concept of that because everything's over technology. And so my daughter, she's 1, and when Gigi and Big Pop, her grandparents, call, and they just call traditionally, and she just hears their voice, she gets mad and pokes the phone. And she wants us to hold it up for FaceTime. So she didn't even understand that like that's not how the world works anymore. And so all I had to say, I think that there are some programs out there, but I think they're becoming even obsolete. And I really think, another pastor said this today, I thought it was so good, is really we need the revenge of the analog to happen. We need to go back to the analog and say, for our children, it was better when we did this. So we in our family, we're not going to do phones. You can get a phone when you can get a job, and you can pay for it and pay for the insurance and the gas to get to that job and pay for the phone and the insurance on that phone. You can do all that when you have time, and we're not going to do that. I'm not going to pay for you to go ruin your life that way. We We have a few tablets, but we only do it on road trips is our big thing. And then TV, we're always screening before they're watching something, or we know we've seen, or we're watching it with them and we're pausing it and saying, hey, why is her life so miserable right now? Well, it's because she didn't listen to the voice of her father. And now her father has to give his life for her daughter. And everything's ruined. My daughter who's 3, can see that. Oh, she didn't listen to her daddy. And there's a moment where, like Ariel in the movie, she's like, everything's going wrong for her. And my daughter's screaming at the TV, you should have listened to your father! And like screaming at the TV. And so we use that as opportunities. And I think for Gen X parents, it's a great question of how do we actually do it. I think we should stop and say, okay, maybe we just need to take a break and say we're going to get 6 months clean from phones. Okay, so I don't know how old your students are, but one of the big things that happened at this past summer camp, my students and downtown students said the best thing about summer camp is they took our phones away. Isn't that wild? Isn't that wild? I'll tell you a story too. So I'm a millennial, so I didn't have an analog childhood. I had a little bit of a digital, but when I was senior in high school, I'm a young millennial, is when half of the world got a smartphone. I got a smartphone when I was a senior, freshman in college. And when I moved from Savannah to here back in 2020, I took my phone in because it was a recall, and I took it in, gave it to the guy, and he's like, hey, you're about to be without a phone for 2 weeks, right? I'm like, no, I didn't know that, but okay. So I handed it to him, and I walked out, and it was 1999. I was living free. I had to MapQuest things and print it out and go through the whole thing again. And it was amazing. And so that reset me to even myself remember the phone is not the real world. And I think that's what, as we talk about Gen Z the next couple weeks, you're going to see they're consumed with the fake world. They're consumed with that. And so anything we can do as parents, we have to be doing stuff. And so I think that's a great question. And honestly, I think you and your wife should talk about it, pray about it. And I'm going to be here for the next 3 weeks, and I'd love to have conversations with you about that.
I'm a teacher.
Yes.
And taking the phones away, schools that have taken the
Yes.
phones away during class time, bullying has
Yeah.
gone down.
St. Johns County just made it that you're not allowed to have your phones at school anymore. And so I was like, hey,
On bullying.
yeah, so bullying's going down, cyberbullying's going down. And honestly, I wish these kids would just punch each other in the face a little bit more often. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, what did you have? They would get their anger out and not do it online, and us all behind their backs and just get it out and be friends afterwards and clap it up. Yes, that's how I made friends.
As parents, you need to take the time to
Yeah.
understand the technology
Yeah.
so that you can lock down.
Here's the best way. The only way I would know how to do it. Here's the only way I know how to do it. On Apple, I could show you afterwards if you want. You can go on screen time and put restrictions. You have to I would delete all of their apps, and you have a list of apps they're only allowed to have, and they can't install new apps. And the reason for that is if I can just install new apps, I could go to WhatsApp and have an encrypted text message. And I think that really makes their phone into more of a dumb phone. That would be, I think, the best way, a good compromise, because all of the other ways, there's ways around, and the technology's going so fast. AI is going to be defining this generation, so that'll be in the next couple weeks. But it's going so fast that it's not going to even be able to keep up with advancements in technology. Great question. Yeah, we got to go quick. We're not going to get through millennials, but let's go quick. Let's just talk about them for a second. I've never taught a lesson where I thought I'm not going to get through this, and if I don't, it's okay. We've got 2 more weeks. So we'll try to finish as much as millennials as we can next time, and then I'm going to give all of my time to talk about Gen Z. Millennials, real quick, I think the theme verse for millennials and Xers, because they're 2 sides of the same coin, should be Mark 8:34. You can just listen to it. And calling to the crowd with him, his disciples, Jesus said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For a generation, Gen X, and you're about to see Gen Millennial, we need to deny ourselves more often and follow Christ and take up our cross. So millennials, we have boomer parents, Gen X parents. Gen Z is our children and polars, and we don't know what the generation will be for grandchildren. I'm 32. I just turned 32. So therefore, I am at the end of the spectrum for millennials. I identify as a millennial more than my brother or my sister does, who's 96 and 98. They would probably still try to identify as millennial, but they're more Gen Z in how they act. So anyway, 3 crucial areas for millennials. Let's go quickly. I won't talk about what shaped them. Most of you lived through that, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, 9/11. The 2008 financial crisis is a huge marker for millennials, and especially for Gen Z. We'll talk about that later, because financial instability defines Gen Z. Is now they're trying to be influencers and own their own business, and it's pretty cool. I kind of like that. But they wanted to get past that. 2014 is a huge year as well. Anybody else know what happened in 2014? Obergefell. Gay marriage is legalized in all 50 states. It's not passed, but it's through the Supreme Court. Climate change, internet explosion in the 90s. Smartphone comes on the scene in 2007, and 2012, like I said, it's half the world has one. MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all come on the scene. And one of the big defining things about millennials is college education. Everybody's educated, and everybody's in financial ruin and debt. And so that's a big, big indicator. That's actually, each generation has to overcome some big thing. For the silence, it was the Nazis, okay? For the boomers, I don't remember exactly what Trevor said for that. But for Gen X, it's the independence and being sacrificial. For millennials, in my opinion, it's this idea of how do I work hard and pay off my student loans? So anyway, let's keep moving. Independence on steroids. 3 things here. Contradicting my views contradicts my existence. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the independence of Gen Xers went off the rails with millennials. Gen Xers started raising their children overprotective. It's very strange why that happened. I don't fully understand that. But I think it turned into a pride for Gen Xers because they started living almost vicariously through their children and wanted them to be the best. Because I'm independent and I'm the best, and therefore I want my children to be the best. And so they're very protective, Gen Xers of millennials. And so it turns from independence, as Dr. Twin says, whatever her name is, it turns from independence to narcissism. So everybody's obsessed with themselves. I have to love myself. I can't love other people till I love myself. I want to love me. It's all narcissistic. And I'm a millennial, so this is hitting on me too. But it's reached paganistic levels of self-worship at this point. So we worship ourselves to the max. A great book on understanding that is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. He also has a smaller book on the same topic called Brave New World. And those 2 books are amazing. If you want to understand the self-worshiping aspect of our culture, you have to read those books. The next one is I Am Special. Okay? I'm special. I'm special. We're all special, right? And it's interesting, millennials have the highest self-esteem of any generation. You just see it in when they're asked, do you think you're a good parent? We answer 60% or higher, and Gen X and even boomers, they're way down the list of 40 and 45%. We're oh yeah, we're the best parents. We know what we're doing. So there's this sense of I'm special, I know what's best, and it turns into the workplace as being I'm so special, and so when my boss gets mad at me for showing up late and not working hard, it's my boss's fault, it's not my fault. Because it can't be me, I'm special. I'm RJ, I'm special. The rest of you, whatever. And this is what blew my mind, because as a millennial, I realized, that's how I think. We think if we were in charge, everything would be okay. And that's why, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is one of the most popular millennials in politics right now. And she is the embodiment in the sinfulness of millennial generation. But how she thinks is if we were in charge, everything would be better. If we just give it over to the millennials, everything would be better. And Gen X, they haven't taken on that leadership. They haven't moved forward in that. Okay, so millennials, we need to bow down before King Jesus and stop worshiping ourselves. Plain and simple. That's it. Let's keep moving. I've got 5 minutes. Let's go. We are obsessed with sex, but we're not having any sex. This is a very weird topic, a weird thing to talk about, but it really is true. So porn, dating apps, LGBTQ+ are on the rise. And what's surprising is that as millennials, we're a generation that's obsessed with sex and sexual immorality, but we're a generation that has very low levels of sex. You want to know why? Because if you want to have sex on a consistent basis, you need to be in what God calls a marriage. And that's when, if you have a healthy marriage, you're having consistent levels of intimacy with your wife or spouse. And as millennials, we are a very sinful, sexually immoral. We have free sex, contraceptives, pills, abortion, LGBTQ+. It's all mainstream, baby. And so we are totally given over to that, and we're obsessed with it, but at the same time, we're not having any of it. So we're consumed by it, but we don't have any sex. And so the next thing is really interesting is we're single but no mingling, okay? So we're also a generation that's been so consumed with ourselves and our careers and money, especially women in my generation, are so consumed with their careers that we've given up, honestly, of like getting in relationships and doing the hard life of working hard and having kids. Because that's really, really stinking hard. To have, like, get married, that's really hard with marriage. That's really, really hard. And then having kids is, like, extremely hard. And so we don't want to do that. We want to live low, slow lives. Listen to this stat. This is crazy stuff. By 2030, 45%, it's predicted that 45%, if nothing changes, if 45% of women 25 to 44 will be childless and single and have no prospect or desire to be either. No children, no marriage. 45% of the population of women will be in that category. So that's what we're talking about. And so obviously there's taboo breaking and we're obsessed with sex. And the idea comes with, if you're special, express yourself. And so you should find yourself. And the best way to do that is through sexual immorality, because that's what we're all obsessed with. Okay, I think one of the big practical things we need to help millennials with is two big things. There's going to be a massive guilt built up for millennials with LGBTQ plus exploration, detransitioners, people who have cut off body parts and mutilated themselves by doctors. There's going to be massive guilt from that. You're already starting to see it in the news. I know some of you see that. And sexual immorality is going to be massive guilt. And then the other thing is, how are you supposed to grow old if you don't have a wife and kids, or like if you don't have a spouse and kids, if you don't have family? Like, how is a generation supposed to grow old without a whole family? Many of you are older in the room and you know you have a wife and kids. You have this church that will take care of you. How are you supposed to do that if you're a-religious and atheistic, you have no wife, no kids, and no prospect of having that, or no husband and no desire to have kids? That is going to be one of the hardest things. It's a silent problem right now, but it's going to be a huge problem for millennials, and just give it by the end of the decade. Any questions? I'm not going to get into the needing to be spoon-fed, because that could take us for 3 weeks straight without me stopping. So I'm not going to do that. We're going to pick up on that one in 2 weeks. I'll see you again in this room. Any questions, though, on the way out on that? I ran over that really fast. Let me just end with this idea for millennials, is that we need young men and young women to become young men and young women who love Jesus Christ in every aspect of the word. They need to know how to do skills and talents and abilities. They need to understand their natures and their roles in the home and in the church, and their natures as men. And what do men do? We fight, we protect, we lead, we study, we rule, and we love. And as women, how do we help our men accomplish those goals by raising up the next generation of warriors to do that? My generation has no desire for that. And that's one of the saddest things of my generation. And so I'd encourage you, as you think about that, pray on that. And in 2 weeks, I'm going to finish this, and we're going to talk about what this looks like, and then we'll hit Gen Z.